federal or state governments saying all government data should be open as soon as possible and computable and machine readable and usable and so on. Well, taking all that data and making it available overnight is really difficult and may not be necessary. We believe that if we can set up a better feedback loop between the people who are using the data and the agencies that provide it, we can help prioritize the value of open government data so that there is maybe 5 or 10% of all the data that a particular agency might hold that is really useful. If we can help identify it, then we can help get that stuff out there soonest, which will increase the the return on that kind of investment. So that's what we're trying to do here. You can see if you go to our website that it's now possible to filter these companies by state or by sector, by category, and we have about 10 or 15 different categories that we've listed. And we hope that we'll be able to get this very soon to a point where it is very usable and really becomes a basic resource. Just to share some very preliminary findings with you, we have looked at the different categories of companies in the Open Data 500. What's very interesting is that the first tier, and these are two categories that each make up about 15% of the working list we have now. One is finance and investment, which you might expect. The other is data technology. The other, data and technology, meaning companies like Enigma, whose business is making data available to other business, which gives you a sense of how all of this open data is increasingly being seen as a really important resource. After that, we have healthcare, business and legal services, governance, transportation, and energy. Governance meaning, for example, companies that help city governments do their work. And then these other categories have only 1 to 5% apiece, but that does not mean they're unimportant. For example, the Climate Corporation is somewhere in either environment and weather or food and agriculture, or probably both. Those are relatively small categories in terms of the number of companies using data, but Climate Corporation is probably the biggest one on the block right now with $1 billion valuation. So we're still doing a lot of work to see how you really evaluate the ROI in each of these areas. I want to turn now to the second place where open data and big data come together productively, which is open data for scientific research, and where we've recently seen a lot of progress and some really important new things happening. Now, the model for this, in many ways, is the Human Genome Project. So when the Human Genome Project was started a couple of decades ago, it was almost like an arms negotiation. The problem, of course, in science is that, or basic science, biomedical science, is that if you work for a drug company, you want to keep your stuff secret until you can make a ton of money off of it. And if you are in an academic institution, you want to keep it secret until you can publish it before anybody else. Neither of those motivations is particularly conducive to rapid progress, because you have an awful lot of people working in parallel, producing and working with similar data without sharing it in a way that would really enable the kind of value that comes from collaboration. So the Human Genome Project, when it was launched, was so important that the scientists who were involved got together, and it was essentially like an arms negotiation. It was a bunch of people saying, okay, we will share our data if you share yours. And as a result, this proceeded largely as a really open, collaborative project developing big data in science that was also open data for use by anybody. And some of the studies that have now been done, particularly one at MIT, have compared this to similar private sector models of development in genomics and found that there's about a 30% advantage in the speed of scientific advancement when you use this open data model. So now this is becoming more and more of a common model, partly because patients are demanding it. Kathy Giusti, who you can see here, was in her mid-30s. She was a corporate executive. She was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and this is, I think, now about 2 decades ago. And she realized, she was aghast to realize that nobody was really doing research on this. So she started a foundation to fund it. And she insisted that any funding that they give, that the scientists doing the work had to share their data openly, had to publish it openly. This is a model that's now also being followed with Alzheimer's, with Parkinson's, and in other ways as well. And you can see this quote from her. She actually found it morally offensive that scientists would do research on such an important issue and not share the data as soon as they had it. Now, what is happening on the scientific side is that scientists are also finding that in some cases, sharing data is not just something they have to grudgingly accept. It can really help them break a logjam. And one of the concepts here is releasing data as open data so that the entire crowd, thousands of people out there who might have a good idea, can help you solve a problem. One of the breakthroughs here was a couple of years ago at the University of Washington. A group of researchers had been trying to solve a complex protein folding problem that was related to the AIDS virus. They had been working on it for years. They finally decided, online gamers are good at solving puzzles. Why don't we put this on this, why don't we make it a game, put it on this site called Fold It, and just ask these gamers how this, how to fold this protein, what the correct structure seems to be. And a team of gamers solved it in about 3 weeks. So when this paper was published in Nature, the scientists credited them and said it was probably the first published paper in Nature that actually had gamers to thank for its existence. But amazing things can happen when you open the data in this kind of way. This is an example of peer-to-patent, which I mentioned earlier, opening up data about patents and patent applications, another area of engineering and scientific research to see whether people out there know if these ideas are unique or if they've been patented before. And this is really one of the most remarkable experiments. This is a website called Zooniverse, and I had a chance to visit Robert Simpson, who's one of the leaders of it, in Oxford when I was working on my book. They began with problems in galaxy formation. This was started by a PhD student who had to look at the structure of galaxies through the Hubble telescope or various images to determine a certain type of elliptical galaxy that was a little bit unusual and told them something about star formation. Computers apparently are not good at making those visual distinctions. People are. This PhD student was. He had 900,000 images to go through. He went through 50,000 in 1 week. And he was like about to jump out a window because it suddenly occurred to him that he could not possibly complete this without going completely mad. So what he did, he and his colleagues came up with this very novel idea of posting this stuff online, posting the images online, giving very simple directions about how to identify the particular kind of galaxy they were looking for. And they found in no time they had tens of thousands of volunteers. Since then, they have applied the same objective or the same approach to all kinds of scientific problems. What you're seeing on the screen here is one of the first biomedical applications looking to identify different kinds of cancer cells. This Zooniverse site now has something like 800,000 volunteers who do this work for free because they want to contribute to the advancement of science and they get tremendous satisfaction from it. So opening data enables you to tap an incredible human resource that would not be possible otherwise to get outside the lab. So that's a segue into this larger question of how can you get data from the crowd. So if you look at Zooniverse, that's a case where the scientists have all this data, they're putting it out there and asking thousands of people to help them analyze it. You can actually take that a step further and you can create big open data sets by getting people in the public to contribute data to you, not just analyze data you already have, but contribute new data. So a scientific example, which is kind of in this way the flip side of Zooniverse, is a number of environmental projects that are going on now that are really about collecting data in different kinds of ways. SkyTruth, to some degree, follows the Zooniverse model. They've used all kinds of satellite images and asked people to look at them to help identify, for example, damage caused by fracking. But there are other similar kinds of organizations now where you can go get your own weather balloon for like $95. They'll send you a weather balloon, you blow it up, you send it up, you take measurements, you send the measurements to them. So we're seeing this kind of citizen science movement in a way that can really gather and create data sets that didn't exist before and that can be very valuable. Now, if you think about it, a lot of the familiar applications that we use these days really are based on this principle. Waze, which helps you get the best route every day with real-time help from other drivers. This is completely about gathering data from people who voluntarily submit their driving data so that Waze can calculate traffic patterns and help advise you on the best way to get where you're going. And as their motto says, nothing can beat real people working together. So it's data from the crowd that otherwise would not exist. This, I think, is perhaps the single most inspiring example of this. This is an organization called PulsePoint that began in California and is now spreading around the country. Their goal, as they put it, is enabling citizen superheroes, and they actually kind of do this. The way this works is that if you know CPR or another kind of life-saving technique and you volunteer, you register and it tracks where you are. Again, this is all voluntary. This is something you're doing as a good Samaritan. If somebody then, who is also part of this service, is having cardiac arrest, it will locate everybody who knows CPR in the immediate vicinity so that somebody can get to them and save their life much more rapidly than an ambulance. And as you probably know, with CPR, there's a tremendous correlation between the speed with which somebody is helped and their chances of good survival. So this just shows you how this can be powerful in a life-saving way and, in a sense, in a society-changing way, because this is about establishing a kind of social contract among people organized through data that's extremely powerful and I think extremely important. Now, another way in which data from the crowd is starting to play in, and this comes into marketing and business strategy, is in the analysis of social media. I should have updated this slide because in the month or so since I made it, it is no longer 2 billion, but it is now 3 billion tweets every week, which I don't know about you, but I find that kind of terrifying. I have no idea what people are tweeting about 3 billion times, but they are. And if you think about it, there is a massive amount of data out there now about services, about products, about political opinions, all kinds of things through all these social media sites. Well, what's happened now is it has become possible to analyze all this through a technique called sentiment analysis, where kind of emotion meets computation. So I just want to stop for a second and ask, how many people know, don't shout it out, but just raise your hand, how many people know who the woman on the left is? Okay. How many people know who the man on the right is? Yeah, this is great. So I find that in data-related conferences and talks, more people tend to recognize Alan Turing, father of computer science, than recognize Jane Austen, but that's who they are. And essentially the way you can think of this is that if Alan Turing and Jane Austen had a love child, that love child would be sentiment analysis, as unlikely as that may seem. Sentiment analysis is a new set of techniques for analyzing text and all the data that comes in all those tweets and all that other stuff in ways that you can reliably begin to extract opinions and insights about products, services, people, etc. It's an emerging field. It is by no means perfect, but just a week or two ago, and I did a blog about this on my website, there's a big conference on sentiment analysis where this technology is now going even beyond textual data and into other kinds of data like facial expressions, voice, and so forth. Voice turns out to be a kind of open data. You can use certain kinds of programs now to analyze the speech of presidential candidates and understand whether they're angry, whether they're cynical, what their motivation is. Gets a little scary, but I think in some ways there are some applications that are anything but scary. So for example, some of the same people who are doing that research are also trying to see whether this technology can be used to help autistic children understand emotional cues that they otherwise cannot pick up by running the algorithms that will tell them what somebody's face is saying, what somebody's voice is saying. And one example of how sentiment analysis has played out in government is that the city of Washington has done an experiment for the last 2 years where they've used sentiment analysis to evaluate and analyze what people are saying about government agencies like the Department of Motor Vehicles on social media. As you would imagine, when they started, people were not saying such great things. They gave 5 agencies grades. One got a C+, the other 4 got C minuses. But as they have continued to monitor, the grades have gotten better, and that kind of feedback loop has actually turned out to be a way of improving government. Last piece, and this also is a segue, is data for smart cities. So in addition to trying to do sentiment analysis on what people think about the DMV, how else can cities use data? Well, this is now a huge area of research and one where, again, it's big data. If it's made open data, then it is that much more useful to the citizens of that city. We have a collegial group at NYU called the Center for Urban Science and Progress. They're located in the neighboring borough of Brooklyn. And what they are doing is studying urban informatics. They're trying to figure out how you can analyze all kinds of things in a city, from observing traffic patterns to placing sensors all over New York that are going to measure temperature, environmental factors, and so on. And what can you do with this? Well, you can use it to optimize operations, monitor infrastructure, look at public health, emergency management, all kinds of things. Now, a number of cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Palo Alto have been experimenting with making their data more usable and more open, even without doing all the sensor placement that our NYU colleagues are doing. And they're achieving some really interesting things. So one of the first applications was public transportation. City data has been used to develop this app called NextBus that tells you when your bus is coming, so you don't necessarily have to wait out in the rain. You can wait indoors until it's almost there. One of the interesting things about this is that after this company started and was in 1 or 2 or 3 cities, the cities themselves began preparing this transportation data in a standard format that made it that much easier for the company to go and provide the same service to them. So this is a place where you're seeing that the openness of the data really leads to its improvement and to its application. This is about a company called OpenGov. They have sort of jokingly described their company as providing kind of a sim city for real cities. Unfortunately for them, I thought that was a great analogy, so now I show this slide, which I don't think is really how they think of themselves. But in a sense, it is really like that. What they're doing is they're providing a platform that enables any city in the country to put their financial data and their other kind of budgetary data on a graph that looks as simple as what you're seeing in the upper right-hand corner. This actually is revolutionary because most city budgets have been kept traditionally in very difficult to read spreadsheets. This opens it up in a way that not only leads to greater transparency for the citizens, but it also makes it possible for city managers to compare their city to a neighboring city. So for example, if it turns out that they have more police overtime than the city next door, they can ask why that is and begin to make some management decisions. So those are 4 areas where open data / big data is having a big impact. Now I want to just quickly go through how openness, I believe, can solve some of the big data problems that keep a lot of us up at night. First question is, how do you make government more useful? So government data more useful. Making government more useful is also a good goal, but this is about government data more useful. So we know that federal agencies have all kinds of data. How do you do something with this? And how do you turn it into a positive force? Well, President Obama, I think to his great credit, began on this road last May, although his administration actually has been working on this even before that, by launching what was called the Open Data Policy. And he launched this, as you can see from this quote, with the express intent and the express idea that opening up government data would actually be a key resource for businesses of all kinds and entrepreneurs of all kinds. And the Open Data Policy has a number of very good things in it. It says that the presumption of openness means that government data ought to be open and available to anybody unless there's a reason like privacy or security for it not to be. Machine readable, meaning computers can use it, reusable, all this good stuff. Well, this sounds great. The problem is that most federal data kind of looks like this. You may recognize this as the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The most dispiriting thing about this metaphor is that people in government themselves actually use it. You know, they actually talk about their own data in this kind of way. It's like you've got a warehouse with all kinds of great stuff in it somewhere, but good luck finding it. There are an estimated 10,000 different federal information systems, not databases, but systems. Each of those systems has a lot of databases in it. They are legacy systems technologically. They often don't work well. They don't interoperate with each other. To give you an example of what that means, OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency have a number of facilities, factories, and so on that they both regulate. OSHA looks at them for workplace safety. EPA does for pollution and their environmental records. It would be very interesting to just mash up those 2 data sets, look at the same set of factories, and say, okay, which ones have both environmental and labor problems? You actually can't do that. you can't do that without going through a lot of effort or using a third-party solution because the databases don't match up, even though they're looking at the same kinds of data. So I believe that a large part of this solution is openness, that the whole goal of making data open will become easier because the data is open in a kind of circular way. And I think the way that this happens is that we need to move to what I've called demand-driven data disclosure. Government data has largely been a supply-side phenomenon. What's happened is that agencies have tried to make their data open. They've been asked to make their data open by the president, by others, by the heads of the agencies. And what they do is they say, okay, we have all these data sets. Here are some that we think are important. Let's put them out there. Well, you know, no offense to government workers. I was one myself for 3 years, and I met fantastically smart and dedicated people there, but it's inevitable that if you've been in an agency for 10 or 20 years, you're going to have a particular view of what's important that may not be the same view your users have. So one of the things we're trying to do at the GovLab, and the Open Data 500 is part of this, is to set up a system of multi-stakeholder engagement where all the data users can really give direct feedback and meet with the data owners in the agencies to help prioritize what really is important. And then you don't have to look at that whole vast warehouse. You can zero in on the pieces that are going to be most useful. One other thing that's happening now, one other thing that's happening now that is potentially very significant is that we have actually found something in the world that Ralph Nader and Grover Norquist agree on, which in itself is amazing. And that thing is called the Data Act. It stands for Digital Accountability and Transparency Act. Without going into a lot of detail, this is an act that has tremendous bipartisan support. It passed the House virtually unanimously. It's got strong support in the Senate. And the goal is to make government spending, federal spending, more transparent than it has ever been, which means that you would not only be able to track the top-level contractors that get a government contract, you would be able to track how they spend their money with subcontractors, sub-subcontractors, and so on, so you can actually see how every federal dollar is spent in a way that's much more accurate and precise than has ever been possible. This, again, I think, is a form of openness that really is going to make that kind of data much more useful, much more valuable. All right, the second area, privacy and personal data. Well, we all know about these guys. One of the unfortunate things, I think, in data science is that there is now a very common association, understandably, of big data with the NSA program, which in many ways, even disregarding the fact that much of it was leaked, the intent of the NSA program was to be the exact opposite of open data. So this is an example of big data that's been very closed, and I think we've seen some of the issues that arise in terms of public perception and trust and so on when big data sets are collected and held by the government without transparency. Similar thing happens when they're collected by large companies. Target got a lot of scrutiny a couple of years ago because they were using proprietary data about their customers to send them often very personalized and sometimes offensively personalized messages about what they thought they were going to buy next. And then, of course, fairly recently, 40 million credit card numbers were stolen from Target. So that was a kind of worst-case scenario. Company is holding all this information about me I'm not sure that I want them to have, and oh, guess what? Somebody just stole it, making it even worse. So we have, I think, as a society, a lot of negative associations with big data that are around these issues of privacy and personal data. Well, again, we need to rethink, even on a very basic level, how we approach this. So forget about the NSA, forget about massive retailers, just think about all those websites you click agree on all the time. So that, of course, is after you have carefully read all of the terms and conditions, you've evaluated whether or not you really agree with paragraph 7 or you would prefer paragraph 9. And frankly, even if you did that, it would be completely useless because this is what I believe lawyers call contracts of adhesion. You basically don't have a choice. You either accept or you don't use the service. So in addition to that, it has been calculated that if you actually did read all of those disclosures before you clicked agree, it would take you a month out of every year for basically absolutely no purpose. So this model of privacy protection, not so great. Some of the smartest people in data science now have been starting to rethink this. One of these, who is a brilliant thought leader, of course, is Sandy Pentland at the MIT Media Lab. And a couple of years ago, he proposed something he called the New Deal on Data, which was actually based on Old English common law. And he said, you know, why don't we just agree on 3 basic propositions? You have the right to possess your data. As the data owner, you have full control over it, and you can dispose of it or distribute it as you like. Well, these are kind of simple but radical ideas, but these are important enough that the World Economic Forum, for instance, has now done a series of papers on the value of personal data. And the model they're looking at, and this is one of their diagrams, is a model that is now technically possible, where you actually would have technical control about all sorts of personal data about your health, your finances, etc. You could hold it in a secure data vault, and you release it when you choose to, in ways that you choose to. So if this works, then this is a special case of openness, right? It's not like about making data available to the whole world, because you certainly don't want that done with your personal data, but it's about making it available to you as an individual in a more open way that gives you that kind of control. One of the great examples of this is Blue Button. This was a program started in the Veterans Administration to give vets access to their medical data. They thought, the people who started it thought a few thousand people might use it. Very soon they had hit 1 million. It's now available from private health insurers as well. And it's a way of getting data that's part of a big data set that had been held by somebody else and making the part that's important to you open to you. And there's even a theory now that you may in the future be able to release your data selectively, so that, for example, if you happen to be in the demographic that would go buy a new Mercedes, and if you are, good for you, but if you happen to be in that demographic, the Mercedes dealer might actually pay you $200. If you release the data that let them identify you, they might pay you $200 to come on their lot, because the value of them getting a qualified customer on the lot is about $2,000 in terms of the expectation that they're going to buy a car. So we could eventually see, by making data open to the users, open to the people that it's about, we could see a whole change in the value proposition for commercial as well as other kinds of data. I think I'm going to run a little past 8, but I think we have till 8:30, so I hope that's okay. I'll just go through the last 2 points, and then I would love to take questions. This third one on creating a see-through society is, I think, where we are already going and where we're going to need to go. We are seeing in many, many places that when big data is made open, it really does create a more transparent and democratic and accountable society. ProPublica is one of my favorite organizations. They are one of the pioneers of data-driven journalism. They're using big data that is open to them, and in some cases going to court to get it open to them, to do all kinds of investigative reports that simply would be impossible without these data sets. The Sunlight Foundation, which I'm sure many of you know, is doing a lot of work on Congress cronyism and campaign finance. My favorite app of theirs is something called Ad Hoc, that in the last election cycle you could actually point it at the TV. It would recognize the sound print of the ad, and it would immediately tell you who sponsored it. So that I think was kind of impressive. But they do a tremendous amount of work, again, using open data to make these kinds of issues transparent to the public. Now, one of the trends we're seeing here as well is open data from consumer complaints. These two millennials, Courtney Powell and AJ Foudy, have started a company called Public Demand that essentially collects consumer complaints and amplifies them through social media. So if you're AT&T or United Airlines, who I think what happened was Courtney Powell had 1 week in which, it wasn't AT&T, Time Warner Cable wanted to charge her $900 for a cable box she didn't have, and United Airlines stuck her on a flight with the worst customer service ever, and when she finally was in the air, she started sketching out the idea for this company that would take complaints about companies like Time Warner Cable and United Airlines. So they got theirs in the end. But what this is about is taking customer complaints and aggregating them in a sort of sentiment analysis kind of way as a form of open data. This is not only coming from companies like Public Demand. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has now made this into a science. They've created a huge database of complaints about credit cards. They're doing the same on mortgages, debt collection, and so on. And this can actually be analyzed academically and in other ways to tell you which bank is the worst at customer service. And if you read magazines like American Banker or Forbes have recently written about this, they're taking this very seriously, and they're actually transforming how they think about customer service because this open complaint data is forcing them to do that. Same thing with recalls. Government recalls are difficult to use because they have traditionally been managed by 6 different federal agencies. Those are now being pulled together in a single site called recalls.gov that brings a new level of accountability to product safety. And I think one of the most important developments we're seeing is more depth on information for investors that is leading to greater corporate social responsibility. This is a company called Analytics Insight that is able to analyze data on 40,000 public companies. That's about as many public companies as are traded globally, in ways that give instant updates on their status. But you're also seeing much more concern about not just economic and financial stability, but about the sustainability of the company's practices. This company called Good Guide provides environmental advice to consumers about the environmental sustainability of products that they buy. What you're seeing now is that organizations like the Climate Disclosure Project are doing a similar thing, but on a massive scale. This organization represents $87 trillion in money held by the institutional investors that use their service. They are all concerned about the carbon footprint of the companies they invest in, and increasingly also their water usage and other sustainability factors. And by providing this kind of information, they're raising the bar for what a sustainable company should be and how it should operate. And finally, some of this is actually being institutionalized at a government level. The Securities and Exchange Commission now requires public companies to report on their use of conflict minerals, which are basically minerals that are found, unfortunately, in most electronic products that are mined under terribly inhumane conditions in the Republic of the Congo. That now has to be reported to the SEC, and that also is a kind of open data that's going to really increase corporate social responsibility. So the last area, and then I will wrap up and we can have some questions, is the use of open data for development. And this is sort of uncharted territory, but I think it's important to note because as people have been looking at the economic value of open data in places like the US and the UK, organizations like the World Bank are starting to ask, could this work in developing countries as well? So one of the people there, Prasanna Lal Das, who I've talked to recently, has talked about all the issues in using open data in developing countries. It's very hard to find high-value data. Technical issues are often a problem. It's not easy often to apply it in the same way that you could in the US, but some people are coming up with very creative solutions. For example, you remember I talked about the Climate Corporation at the beginning, that using massive amounts of data in very complex analytics. Farmerline is, in contrast, a company that has started in Ghana, where more than half the population lives by farming, but where very few people have access to high technology. Many are not literate in the way they would need to be to use that kind of information, but everybody has a cell phone. So what this entrepreneur did is he developed this thing called Farmerline that takes the basic information that a family farmer would need, feeds it to them by cell phone, and makes it possible not only to read it, but to hear it by voice in any of the local languages used in that country. So this is, I think, just a great example of how people in developing countries, which have a lot of tech-savvy entrepreneurs and a lot of penetration of this kind of mid-level technology, cell phones in particular, are finding ways of using open data that work in that context for them. Some of the lessons here, I think, are about using mobile access and figuring out how to do the work that's needed to bring better quality to data. And again, one of the answers here, again echoing stuff that's been done in more developed countries, is to use the public as a data source. So an organization called Ushahidi has done this. They began by using people with cell phones to just monitor on the ground the rate of violence in Kenya following an election there. They're now doing that kind of crowdsourced gathering on all kinds of issues. For example, they were instrumental in the relief efforts in Haiti when they had the earthquake a few years ago. Indaba is a platform run by by Global Integrity, which gathers a lot of information about corporate practices and corporate responsibility on the ground, again, from people with cell phones that can feed data back. This is the site that has what I think is the best name for a website in the world. It's called ipayidabribe.com. This is an Indian site that this is exactly what you do. You go on there and you say, yeah, I paid a bribe and here's how much it was. And this is cleaning up corruption through transparency and by creating new open data from the public, from the crowd. There's a Russian equivalent of this called Rospil that posts government contracts online, teaches the public how to scan them for signs of fraud. They have apparently saved the Russian people something like $1.5 billion so far in the first year or two. And finally, here's one called Ulula, which is based in New York, but does the same kind of thing by having people in many different countries now where large corporations operate, go out, look at their factories. They focus particularly on the extractive industries like gas and oil. They go out, they see how they're operating, and they feed data back about possible environmental violations, labor violations, and so on. This is a for-profit company. They actually sell the data, among other things, to these extractive industries themselves in the hope that they can do well by doing good, that they can both help them correct their practices and help them work with the communities where they operate in ways that are going to be more productive for them. So I have a couple of lessons here, which I'll just skip over so we can get to your questions. But basically, I think open data really does change the world for entrepreneurs, for businesses, for scientists, for journalists, potentially for everybody. And when it is open data, that is also big data, the power is huge. So I just want to send you to a few sites for more information. I'd urge you to visit thegovlab.org, where you can learn a lot about what we're doing through our wiki, a digest that we put out as well. You can go to my website at opendatanow.com. I also put out a regular free email newsletter, and you'll see back where the books are. There's a sign-up sheet if you would like to get free updates from the GovLab and or opendatanow.com. Just sign your name, put in your email address, and we'll send those to you. And of course, there's this book, which I will be more than happy to sign. Copies are available right outside. So thank you very much, and I think we still have about 20 minutes for questions, but thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your thoughts. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much. That's fine. That's fine. Yes, sir.
You talked about crowdsourcing, and it was a good talk. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You talked about crowdsourcing. You talked about having information given back to the crowd and the crowd giving it back. My question to you is the nuance wearable technologies. You can wear the watch, the Google glasses coming up on the screen.
Right.
Which can actually transfer data without reviewing. This will change the way we control information and how that influences the big data itself. So the devices that we wear is actually harnessing the information that we have on a daily life and sending it out to the big data.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is really about wearable technology like Google Glasses, and how do they change this environment, since these are ways that you can actually gather. I mean, if I were wearing them, I could be gathering all this information right now and transmitting it who knows where. I think we're not going to know that for a while, but one thing that is interesting to me is my sense is that people who are working on data analysis are already thinking about how do they keep this from getting out of control. So I mentioned that I was at this symposium on sentiment analysis a couple of weeks ago. It was a fascinating presentation by a professor at the MIT Media Lab. She has developed very advanced ways of essentially reading emotions from facial expressions, much more sophisticated than the way this has been done in the past. And this is some of the research that as I mentioned, that is helping autistic children. You can very easily imagine putting this in Google Glasses, and whoever you are talking to, you can tell what they're thinking, what they really think about you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Google has not been eager to let that app be put on their glasses. And I think they're really in the middle now of figuring out whether and under what conditions this kind of software should be available through wearable tech, because you can imagine it could completely change the nature of social interactions. So I think the potential for data gathering is great, But I think at the same time, the people who are involved in these fields are sensitive enough to know that they have to tread very carefully. And we'll see how it plays out. I think it'll be very interesting to watch. Yes, back there, yeah.
My question is as follows. I'm sure you're aware of Jared Lemier's criticism of how data that is essentially crowdsourced or generated for free by millions and billions of individuals is essentially leveraged for commercial reasons and then used to generate data that is not open but very closed and in a way sort of saps society from value that is essentially generated for free by volunteers and individuals. I mean, personally, just to give you an idea of where I stand on the question, I run a startup, and what we do is exactly sentiment analysis, but we take the stock market. So that's fantastic for us, but really what we're doing is we're taking all of these tweets, we're taking all of these Facebook updates that people submit out of the goodness of their heart for a variety of social reasons, right? And then we monetize the value that is actually generated by all of these people, right? And essentially keep the value that is generated for ourselves. So in a way, you could argue that we've actually taken something from society, right? We've taken all of the sort of time and effort by all these individuals and then monetized them. So my question to you is, how do you see that evolving in the future? Because the resources, look at Facebook, for example, the huge companies, they have the resources to collect the data. We all collaborate in this large experiment of donating our data for free, and then we turn around and monetize it. I guess that's how capitalism works, but clearly that is not an evolution towards society of open data, one, and
Yeah.
not necessarily an evolution towards a society that becomes more efficient, that values being siphoned out of that cycle.
Sure. So no, great question. So if I could summarize, basically you're saying, what's the name of your startup, by the way?
It's called Guideway Consulting.
Guideways Consulting. Okay, so you're doing sentiment analysis. Your company's doing sentiment analysis off of social media, and your question is, as I would read it, should you feel guilty, or should we all feel guilty about the fact that people are just tweeting and posting stuff online just because they want to, and you can use all of that sentiment analysis to create monetary value? Well, I don't think you should feel guilty, but I think there are other people who probably should. But let me tell you why. I mean, this is my personal view. I mean, it'd be great to debate this, but I'll tell you my personal view of this. I think that anything that is posted on social media, meaning, it's a tweet, it's a review, it's something on Facebook, and is posted in a way that it is not protected so that only your friends can see it. I mean, in my view, if you're doing that, it's a public statement, you're putting it out there, it's fair game. And in fact, if you were to tell me that you were using all my tweets to predict stock values, I would not be offended. I would just want to know what you found out so I could invest in the right stocks. And we'll talk afterwards, But, so I don't see that as a problem. However, what I think is much, much more ambiguous is if you're Google, or not to pick on Google, if you're Google or Yelp or Yahoo or any of those, and now what you're tracking is not stuff that I'm posting publicly, but searches that I'm doing only for my own use and really don't intend anybody else to see, then I think you're in very different territory. And I think where we're really going to see the kind of ethical issues coming up is not so much in public social media, but in stuff that is aggregated by these very large companies that, of course, have access to more data than anybody else that was never meant to be public in the first place. And I think that does pose some real issues. Yeah. Yes.
Mike Nelson with Microsoft. We talked about a year ago when I was writing for Bloomberg.
Right, of course. Mike, how are you? Good to see you. Yes.
Really nice presentation.
Thank you.
It's great to see the additional examples and how much you've seen. I was very glad that the first question was about the Internet of Things.
Yes.
My first question. I was surprised you didn't mention sensors more. How government are collecting data through EasyPass.
Right.
Just incredible terabytes of video data.
Yes.
Just the video data on highways.
Yeah.
Monitor traffic is a rich source. And that leads to my second question.
Yeah.
Which is the other word you didn't mention. I didn't hear about de-anonymization. Anonymization of data. There's this huge religious debate going on. Some of the techies are saying,
Right.
we have magic, we can obscure the
Yeah.
data so nobody can figure out whose data is whose.
Yes.
And then the other techies who say, we have stronger magic, we can re-identify the data. And then we have the lawyers who say, forget the technology, we're just going to say you can't re-anonymize the data. Where do you
Okay, so the question is where I stand on a religious debate about data. I probably stand to the side. All right, so this is where I will do my usual disclaimer, which is I am not a technologist and could not code to save my life, although someday I'll hopefully will take the time to learn. I did some in college, but that was quite a while ago. So the question is really, as I understand it, is about the whole question of anonymizing data, and is it possible to anonymize data sufficiently that it truly is anonymous? Again, this is purely a personal opinion. I would say it makes me nervous. And I do know, now, I've talked to people, I know some of the people who are charged with implementing the open data policy in the Office of Science and Technology Policy and elsewhere in the White House. They're certainly concerned about this, and they're very smart people. You also hear people talking about the mosaic effect, which is essentially that you might have 3 different pieces of data, each of which is sufficiently anonymized, but when you put those 3 data sets together, you can find out exactly who that person is, their social security number, what they search for on Google, et cetera. So, there's a number of strategies that you, I'm sure, know much better than me. I just tend to think that the people who want to hack are going to always be half a step ahead of the people who want to protect the data, but I hope that's not true. But on the other hand, you think about this Target situation, right? Target clearly has a very high incentive in not having its credit card information stolen. On the other hand, somebody who thinks they can get access to 40 million credit cards has a really high incentive to try to crack that code. So I think particularly in cases where there's like an overwhelming monetary gain to be had, it's an arms race. So my hope is that anonymization works. I'm not technically proficient enough to know, but I would say I hope it, but I fear that it may not be the case. Great. So I've now managed to wend my way through that religious debate on both sides. Thank you. Yes.
So you discussed releasing images or games to the public and having them solve problems. Have you seen any for-profit publicly traded companies doing this? And is there a concern with who owns the results, or is if it's a patentability issue, who's going to own that intellectual property?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, if you throw a problem out to the public and they help solve it, who owns the results? I think there are a number of companies doing this kind of thing. One is Innocentive. Kaggle and Topcoder are doing similar kinds of things with coding problems. I have not looked carefully at their terms of agreement, but my sense is that if you enter the game, you know the rules before you start. I have talked with a guy named Dwayne Spradlin, who's now head of the Health Data Consortium and was formerly the CEO of Innocentive, and I do write about this some in my book. He had some very interesting observations about how that all works, and his observation was that there are different categories of solvers, that there are people who simply want to do it for the credit, and there are people who are good enough that they really do it as a source of income, and they're better at it. And that if you really want to get the best solvers, at least in the experience of Innocentive, which poses a lot of different kinds of problems, you have to be willing to pay. And particularly, like if you're a pharmaceutical company, nobody's even going to look at the problem if you're asking them to solve it for free. So I think it's almost like a kind of a work for hire agreement in that kind of way. But certainly, I think for anybody participating in these things, it would be very important to know the rules before you start. Yes, sir.
Just wondering about that crowdsourcing model, in the sense that it seems too good to be true, in the sense that there is some skill, I suppose, in finding those star clusters or those cancer cells that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of pictures. It still seems like some qualified person must go through and check that work. And you have the false positives on that level, but then you have all the false negatives in the rest of the picture.
Okay.
I'm not sure how that works as an industrial process.
Sure. So the question is, if you kind of industrialize crowdsourcing, if you have like 800,000 people going onto the Zooniverse and they're all well-intentioned amateurs, can you really trust what they come up with, or do you have to have it all vetted by some expert? Well, a couple of things. One is anything. What they're looking for, I think, largely is unusual formations. So certainly anything unusual that they come up with is going to be what the PhD student is looking for, so they'll look at it carefully. I think that kind of eliminates the false that eliminates the false positives, but you also have the false negative problem. Are people going to miss it? Well, there's a couple of controls on this, and some of which are very interesting. One control is that you have several people look at each galaxy. Let's just keep with the galaxy example. So, by having 5 or 6 or 7 people look at each one, which you can do if you have 800,000 volunteers, you really reduce the risk that just one person's going to miss it or misrepresent it. The other thing, though, which is fascinating, is that what the scientists found when they started doing this was that in some ways the amateurs were actually more accurate than the trained scientists. So I'm going to garble the exact correct science here because I'm not an astrophysicist, even more than I'm not a coder. But just bear with me and pretend that I'm getting the colors and everything right. So let's say that you're looking at spiral galaxies, and blue spiral galaxies are very rare. Most of them are green, and the blue ones tell you something really interesting about star formation. Amateurs will pick up the blue ones more than trained astronomers will, because trained astronomers are cognitively used to the idea that spiral galaxies are supposed to be green. So they may actually be more likely to miss the outliers. The other fascinating thing that happened with Zooniverse is they began to sort of allow people to set up communities, and there's something that was called the green peas phenomenon. It's like a couple of these people started seeing these odd things that looked like green peas in the telescope images. The astronomers had totally missed these, but the amateurs began seeing them. They began trading information. They had a little green peas, forum on Zooniverse, and they found very interesting things. There was another one called Hanna's Voorwerp, I think it is, which is Dutch for something like Hannah's thingy. This was a school teacher named Hannah, I think in her 20s in the Netherlands, who found something that just looked like an odd thingy on one of the images. And that became something they're still trying to figure out what it is. So this odd phenomenon of kind of the untrained but intelligent eye is very, very interesting. One other caveat, though, is that paying people to do this stuff may get you worse results. So some of the experience, for instance, with Mechanical Turk on Amazon, where you actually pay people on a kind of make-work basis, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but really committed, dedicated amateurs who love the idea of doing this in the interest of science may often give you better results than somebody who's being paid $6 an hour to go through galaxy after galaxy, for example. Yeah. Yes?
I'm not sure I'm right about this, but it seems to me that the same technology that allows you to gather ideas, valuable ideas, and thank you for bringing us such a compendium of them, from thousands of people or millions of people, also allows a few people to project ideas out to millions of people. And if you're dealing with something like Wikipedia,
Right.
it's self-correcting, because if somebody puts something down that's really out there, all these other people can fix it. But, I was thinking about this when I saw your slide on conflict materials. Right now, it's the case that, it may be about failure to properly recycle computer parts and stuff like that. But the actual government law that everybody's dealing with now, small business are having all this trouble keeping up with, has to do with monitoring of where you get your tin from and whether
Right.
it's one of these 12
Right.
Central African countries. Unintended consequences, of course, in some way, but I'm worried that sometimes the big data and open data is not really the big picture. There's no way to see it all.
So as I'm understanding your question or observation, it's that, even if we're calling for open data and conflict minerals as an example, there's questions about the validity of the data, the source of the data, how do you get accurate data? If you're crowdsourcing something, how are you sure that the data people are giving you is accurate or reliable? Is that what you're...
It seems to me to generate a lot of public pressure to do something about human rights violations
Right.
in Africa, but you may overwhelm these small business people trying to, manufacturers in the Midwest here struggling. The
Yeah.
Michigan legislature just passed a thing begging the Congress to undo this part of Dodd-Frank.
That's very interesting. I actually didn't. Thank you for sharing that, because I was not aware. I mean, I know there have been issues with it, but I wasn't aware of that happening in Michigan, where apparently the legislature wants to undo this part of Dodd-Frank. Yeah, I think to be honest, I think I sped through that slide a little too quickly because I was getting near the end. I agree with you that it is not as simple as it might seem. Another issue is, does it achieve the end you want if what happens is that the most reliable companies or the ones most concerned about their image simply leave conflict mineral mining to companies that are going to go ahead and do it anyway, or that may not be subject to SEC regulations and so on. So I would agree. I would agree that it's more complex than that. I think the ultimate aim of this, frankly, in an ideal world, would not be to have everything be in an SEC mandate, but I do think there's a growing interest with a lot of companies in practicing sustainable practices and being very public about it. Unilever is one of the big examples, which has a CEO who's talks a lot about sustainability. As far as I can tell, appears to walk the talk, and they've done, their stock price has gone up quite a bit since he's been CEO. So I think somewhere between government mandates and a kind of ethos that makes it really advantageous for companies to disclose, to operate sustainably and disclose that they're doing so, is probably where we'll find the solution. But I think the conflict minerals example is a very interesting one, but I agree with you that it has a lot of complexities and is not a perfect solution, I would say. Thanks. You had a question, I think?
Sort of related to that.
Yeah.
In my mind, it was sort of like what I think of as like the Yelp effect. So when you were talking about reporting of, say, ocean conditions or environmental concerns,
Right.
those would be skewed by competitors or disgruntled employees, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is about the Yelp effect, which is, I would summarize it as basically, how do you know people aren't lying when they do reviews?
And maliciously lying, but
Yeah.
like maliciously re-reporting and,
Yeah, yeah,
their reviews,
yeah.
the other guy.
Yeah, right. Either slamming the other guy or No, there's an Italian restaurant near where my wife is here. So right near where we live in Westchester is there's some Italian restaurant that I read about on Yelp, and it was either the best Italian food this side of Tuscany or a roach-infested pit. And I still can't figure out how that could be. But they were two different reviews, one apparently written by the restaurant across the street. So, and one by the owner. It's a huge problem. I asked a number of people when I was researching the book, so how many fake reviews are there? One person who was the head of a sentiment analysis company said it's about 5%. A Gartner industry report said it's about 15%, and an academician who studies this all very carefully says it's about 35%. So the short answer is we really don't know. I think the hope is that we will get good enough. Well, two things. One is that the volume is large enough that if you're really looking at 3 billion tweets a week, you would expect that this would start to wash out. I mean, if you're doing Yelp reviews of a restaurant that only has 5 reviews, it's pretty easy to game the system. If you've got something that thousands of people are writing about, it's a little more difficult. There are also things that the sites can do to reduce the risk of fraud. They claim that they do them. One example is you look at the time that something is posted, and if a review of a New York hotel is posted at 3 a.m., but it happens to be lunchtime in Bangalore, then you might suspect that they're farming out the reviews, which people do. I think to some degree sentiment analysis will be helpful here, because ultimately those algorithms are going to be getting better and better at figuring out different kinds of linguistic patterns and so on that tell you whether something's authentic. But one of the most interesting things, and I think we'll probably close on this, one of the most interesting things is that one of the hardest things for computers to understand algorithmically is when a tweet or a review is sarcastic. I mean, what are the odds of that? So, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.
So I want to thank Joel again. Also give one bit of help on the Yelp phenomenon. That is, if the review says, "I just had the best possible dinner imaginable at 55 West 12th Avenue, where they have free parking on Thursday nights," you know that that's written by the owner, that if there's too much detail, that's fake. I want to thank everybody for coming. So tomorrow, we're getting a very early start. That's the bad news of the good news. We're starting at 8:15, but the unqualified good news is we will have food and coffee here at that time. There could be, more people have registered in advance than there are seats in the auditorium. So the seats are going to go to the registered people who show up first. We're going to have overflow rooms for people who get here a little later, but I want to give you this inside information here. If you've registered in advance, come early. You'll get a seat in the auditorium and your coffee and breakfast. And we have a very full and exciting day tomorrow. 4 panels, a featured talk by Kate Crawford, and 6 Ohio State faculty doing a Pikaka-cha session over lunch where you'll hear about some of the data-related work going on at Ohio State. So it'll be a long but exciting day. I hope you'll join us at 8:15. Thanks very much.